But I want to make sure that through the repetition of the themes that are through here, that you guys are actually following along and paying attention. So, starting in verse 1 through 6, what is the theme of that section? What do we talk about? Don't just belt it out. It's fine. You don't need to raise hands or anything. I'm not worried about you talking over each other. Someone other than James. What concepts did we discuss? Verses 1 through 6. Does that help clarify it, Jasmine? Is that... You were all here for this, right? A few exceptions, obviously. Yeah. Are y'all just too afraid to call it out, or do you really not know? I suppose if they were too afraid to call that out, they'd be too afraid to identify the two. The law is for the living and not the dead. How do y'all feel? Does that sum up that section? Does the law apply to those that are dead? Was JFK's assassination ever resolved in a court of law? Why wasn't it resolved in a court of law? What's that? The alleged shooter was himself murdered, so they no longer continued with the persecution of Lee Harvey Oswald because he was dead, and it makes absolutely no sense to then apply the law to him and to put him in jail. Remember I talked about The Adventures of Superman with George Reeves? And that episode, The Man in the Cube? Where the man stayed in the cube for... Anybody? A long time. Stayed in the cube for 7 years. Because after 7 years, with nobody hearing from him and nobody seeing him, you can legally be declared dead. And therefore, if he stayed in there long enough, all of the crimes that were attributed to him would go away, would cease to apply to him, because he would be legally declared dead, and he would be free to live his life as he saw fit. Once you are dead, the laws no longer apply to you. And the way that applies to us here is that we have become dead to the law. How did we do that? Through Christ. When we were baptized through Christ, we joined him in defeating death, becoming dead to the law, and we joined him in being born anew, raising from the dead, as it were, and therefore the law no longer applied to us. We were free not to live by the rule of the law, but to live by the spirit of the law. Because remember, Christ didn't come and do away with the law. He fulfilled the law completely. There's a reason that we do this. Do we do it so that we can warm a pew on Sundays? No. Thank you for a definitive no. A few heads were shaken, but some people were just staring at me like they don't know what I'm talking about. We will have some product, right? Every action that we do will produce something. So, when we died to the law and were born again in Christ, our lives will now produce some type of fruit. What type of fruit would that be? Fruit of the Spirit. right? So it doesn't look like just sitting around warming a pew, regardless of what you may have seen in movies or read in books or seen in real life. We will have some type of produce, and it is a change from the produce that existed from our actions when we were still in the law, when we had not yet died to the law. So thank you for that quick review of 1 through 6. How do we feel about 7 through 13? What is the purpose of the law? Is the law bad? Is the law sinful? What? Right. It exposes sin, and sin then subverts the law to cause you to want to do that more than you want to do good. Now, Paul specifically points out coveting. And what is the difference between the other 10 commandments and coveting? It's an internal thing. It's not an external thing. So you could keep all of the other laws. You could show them by your actions or lack of action. But there is still that one that is internal. Remember, we talked about the very thought of being mad at your brother is akin to having physically murdered your brother. So your thought life is not exempt from this, and the law points that out as well. But sin subverts the law, which is holy, and causes you to focus specifically on the sin and even sin more, possibly. Now, this doesn't come without some struggle. Verses 14 through 17 we talked about last week. Do we know what is right and always do what is right? Do we know what is right and do what is wrong? Do we know what we're doing is wrong, but yet sometimes we still do it? That was akin to being falling back into old habits with our former relationship with our slave master. I talked about the thinking of your previous marriage, to the perfectionist, to the law that came out with the white glove and checked all the shelves, made sure that you were adhering to a strict code. 248 things that you must do, 365 things not to do. The do's and the don'ts. All right. The reason that we review is not just because I like sitting here and respouting stuff back to you or seeing what you'll actually send back. It's because, remember, everything that we read in Scripture has context, and as we interpret the Bible by reading it, we must understand the context and not take things out of context. And that becomes specifically poignant when we talk about today's verses, which are verses 18 through 20. So I will read to you just, 14 through 20 today. So Romans chapter 7, verses 14 through 20, and we'll focus on 18 through 20. So the trouble is not the law, for it is spiritual and good. The trouble is with me, for I am all too human, a slave to sin. I don't really understand myself, for I want to do what is right, but I don't do it. Instead, I do what I hate. But if I know what I'm doing is wrong, this shows that I agree that the law is good. So I am not the one doing wrong. It is the sin living in me that does it. And I know that nothing good lives in me, that is, in my sinful nature. I want to do what is right, but I can't. I want to do what is good, but I don't. I don't want to do what is wrong, but I do it anyway. But if I do what I don't want to do, I am not really the one doing wrong. It is the sin that is living within me that does it. Now, the reason I said that context is important, these verses here have been used to lay a foundation for something called total depravity. It's not a phrase that you're just now hearing, right? You've heard this before. Who thinks they have a handle on what the concept of total depravity means? I got at least 2 people back there. That's good. Kelsey, do you feel like sharing what you think total depravity is? So nothing has worth. You personally don't have worth. So nothing really matters. Is that right? Anybody else want to add to Kelsey, or we think we're good with that? Rose? So you're defining total depravity as the inability to save ourselves from sin? Okay. Make sin more powerful? Right? Okay. So, What's that? Everything you do is bad? Okay. I could accept little pieces of all of that. I mean, it sounds like you guys have the basic concept of what total depravity is. Do we believe in total depravity? Do you understand why we don't believe in total depravity? If you take what Rose has said combined with Colin and Kelsey, what's that? It's hopeless. Makes sin more powerful than God. Total depravity includes a component saying that God would not want to have anything to do with us, and He cannot approach us because we are totally depraved. It's not just about us being able to approach Him. Total depravity is also about His inability to approach us. So that does make sin more powerful than God. So you're all on the right track in getting to that. The reason we don't believe in total depravity is because we know for a fact that God can seek after us and approach us in the state that we are in. We are not cast off, unable to be saved at all. Total depravity, in its truest understanding, would mean that there is literally no hope for us, and we cannot be saved because we have no value. That's not what this passage is saying. That's not the context at all. So, with that understanding that this really has nothing to do with total depravity, even though it has been used as a foundation and a platform for total depravity, that means we have to define, therefore, what it is talking about. Are you ready for that? Yes, okay. I got a yay. No amens or hallelujahs. All right. So, is there hope for us? There is hope. Is there hope for us because of our own action? we are, in and of ourselves, unable to overcome sin. This is another reason that Paul in the previous verses talks specifically about coveting. Though we may be able to show the trappings of having overcome sin, living a perfect life by the actions that we take never really deals with our inner selves, never really deals with what's going on inside. Because you can make everything look perfect. That doesn't mean that everything actually is perfect. What are your motivations for doing that? Do you suffer from coveting? Do you want what is not yours? Do you desire it so strongly that you contemplate what you may do to be able to obtain it? Paul says here that nothing good lives in me, that is in my sinful nature. Remember, when we're talking sinful nature, we're talking about flesh. In my flesh. There's two types of flesh that are talked about in the Bible. There's flesh, which is sinful nature, which is your bodies, and it's always talked about in a negative manner. And then there's the Word that became flesh, which is always talked about in a positive manner. The flesh that is used here is specifically talking about that sinful nature, that bad manner. Now, that's not to say that the physical is bad and the spiritual is good. Please remember, in context. I want to do what is right, but I can't. That shows an understanding of what is right. It's not a vacuum with no rules, with no boundaries. There's a clear understanding, this is what I should be doing. But there is the inability to follow through and to, therefore, do it. Even after you become a Christian and you die to the law and you die to sin and you conquer that through Christ, you're not immediately broken of all of your habits. Some people are. Not my experience. It's not most people's experience. Right? It's like, okay, how many people have seen Captain America Civil War? How many people want to eventually, and I shouldn't spoil it for you? How about the Manchurian Candidate? Both versions. Both versions. Both the 1962 version and the 2004 version. Same thing. Hey, I did research, okay? And yes, I have seen both versions. Okay, so let's go with the Manchurian Candidate for John's benefit. I got your back, buddy. All right. So the Manchurian Candidate is based on a Richard Condon book written in 1959. Largely plagiarized, but that's beside the point. The movie, the original, was put out in 1962, and there was a remake done in 2004. In the movies, you have soldiers that are taken captive by the Koreans, and then you have these memories implanted that the